Well, we continue our study in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 23, and we'll be covering only a few verses this time from verses 6 through 15. Now, remember in our last study, Paul had just been hauled before the Sanhedrin, and he'd been taken there by the soldiers, and the actual commander went with them, trying to settle this matter about Paul and the Jews who were so viciously attacking him. And quite frankly, we see this Sanhedrin had a very strong influence on the people. And in fact, a lot of people were downright frightened by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish people, because they could impose all kinds of punishments on the Jewish people if they broke the law or broke some of the actually self-serving rules they themselves made up. They had control over the people and could put them out of the synagogue and give them no access to the place of worship and discussion about the things of God on the Sabbath. So the Sanhedrin did have a lot of power, but they were made up of a mixture of both Pharisees and Sadducees, and perhaps some others of different views. We're not certain about that. But anyway, the high priest had just slapped Paul on the face, and Paul had answered back. It was in our last study. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. that was quite a statement. You whitewashed wall. In other words, underneath you're dirty, and what you are is just a whitewash. And then he was told he was a high priest, and Paul kind of apologized and said, well, I didn't know he was the high priest. I don't know that they dressed any differently, because as a high priest, they usually wore robes that were very, very extravagant. And we get to verse 6 in Acts chapter 23. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees, and Sadducees said there's no spirits, there are no angels, there's no such thing as resurrection. And so Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others were Pharisees. Now the Pharisees, they did believe in spirits and angels, and they believed in an eventual resurrection. So he called out to them, and he shouted out to them, called out in the Sanhedrin, like I say, probably shouted at it, because they were a kind of a loud lot of protagonists. My brothers, he said. Now, some historians say that Paul, while he was still Saul, was actually a member of the Sanhedrin, and we're not sure of that exactly, but he did say this in verse 6, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assemblies of the Sanhedrin were divided. Paul was a pretty smart operator, and when he called out that I'm a Pharisee, I believe in the resurrection, and that's why I'm here before you. What's all the big deal? And so in verse 8 we read, and this is recorded by Luke, the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are angels and there are no angels and no spirits. But the Pharisees believed all of these things. So there was a great uproar, we read in verse 9. Great uproar. And somehow I can imagine these people, it's like being around the table and the whole family arguing a hot point. And everybody's got an opinion and they're yelling it out. And it got rather into what the Bible calls an uproar. There was a great uproar. And some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, he said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander the Roman commander, was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. I would really like to have been there to see these supposedly sedate and pious leaders getting into such a hot argument. They were probably in red-faced frenzies as they were arguing about, now they were arguing about the resurrection, or is there one or is there not one? Paul knew how to light a fuse, and it had just exploded in the Sanhedrin. I'll tell you this, and this is true anywhere. When unity diminishes, discord erupts, and authority diminishes. So unity is a very necessary thing in the church, in a country such as our own Canada. We need unity very much at this point. And without unity, discord erupts and authority diminishes. We've seen a lot of that in these past 2 years, actually, here in Canada and around the world, because of the COVID-19 that is slowly becoming understood a little better, and some of the politicians are beginning to realize that they've overreached to quite a degree. We've seen a lot of this discord and lack of unity. So we go to the rest of verse 10, which says, the commander was afraid these people were going to tear Paul apart, literally limb from limb of the way. It must have been a rough situation. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. That's where the soldiers stayed, of course, in the barracks. That would have been an interesting evening and night for the troops, I'm sure, the soldiers. But can you imagine the pulling and pushing and the shoving that took place? And I suppose the devil was dancing in delight because of these religious leaders who got sidelined on something that they argued about so thoroughly and so roughly and so really discourteously. So Paul spent the night in the Roman barracks with the troops. I dare say it was a very interesting night for the Roman soldiers, and they got an earful of the gospel, likely, knowing Paul and his reputation for speaking out boldly about the things of God. Then in verse 11, the following night, the Lord, not an angel this time, not a spirit, but the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." You see, God was not done with Paul yet. Paul had already gone through an awful lot. He'd been stoned. He'd been criticized. There'd been uprising and uproars in 6 different cities where he had preached the gospel in Asia. And he'd had his share of trouble. But God was not done with Paul yet. In verse 12, we read this, because there were some people that were done with Paul. They were fed up with him. They were angry with him, and they wanted to kill him. Let's read this together. It's in verse 12 of chapter 23. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they killed Paul. That's pretty serious. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. Verse 14, they went to the chief priests and to the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you elders, you chief priests, now you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting to more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets there." Wow. Things are getting serious here. They went to the chief priests, who at this time were Sadducees, and they didn't believe in the resurrection, and we're going to kill Paul. Arrange this. We'll look after it for you. There's 40 of us. We've taken a solemn oath. We're going to kill Paul. And so the plot thickens, and Paul finds himself between a rock and a hard place. But you see how wise Paul was. I guess I don't know whether the phrase divide and conquer was known in those days, but certainly that's what he had done when he went into the Sanhedrin on this particular occasion. I'm on trial here for something most of you believe, or some of you believe. You Pharisees, you believe in the resurrection. You believe in angels. You believe in spirits. And he divided the whole Sanhedrin. And what a place to leave Paul right now under the threat of death. And we'll deal with that in the next lesson. God bless you. Be wise, as Paul was, when you go into any situation. And as he was, prompted by the Spirit, speak as God teaches you and urges you and nudges you. God bless you. Have a great day. We'll see you the next time.